Okay, great. So we're gonna get started. We are extremely grateful for Intermediate to come and talk on trade winds and trade walls as developing World Bank. So,
So much. I mean, it's truly a pleasure to be here, and I mean that because it isn't at all. It isn't at all a pleasure to be in Washington these days. So you easily win that contest. The other thing is that I'm very, very happy to be here with some of my most liked partners, especially Betty Goldberg. She and I didn't overlap at the World Bank, but I would say she's one of my favorite chief economists in the World Bank, and I can also tell you who's my least favorite. I won't do that right now. I'll tell you. But I'm going to tell you. I'm going to speak about trade and things. I'll see if this works. Saying the wrong thing. No, there you go. Okay, so I'm going to make three observations, and one is about populism, one is about globalism, and one is about multilateralism. So this is not a rigorous presentation. It's what my daughter would call a loosey-goosey one. Yeah. And the point I'll say is that I actually started to read up about populism, and I was a bit surprised myself that it's actually not that bad a thing, at least not always. The other thing that I've been doing is reading up a lot about what's happened over the last 20 years or so, and to talk about globalism especially. And I think one of the things that has happened is that globalism had a problem in the sense that it became somewhat extreme in many ways. And then the third part I'll tell you about, and this is very close to us at the World Bank and the IMF and other places, is that we think that multilateralism is a good thing, and I think most people do. But I think that most people have started to also think that it's failing. Yeah. So I'll say a few things about these things, and I'll show you some slides along the way. But mainly, I came to Yale to ask you for advice, okay? And this is where the trade winds and trade walls part comes. So actually, developing economies have done very well because of trade, right? Trade winds have been great for them. They've moved them along up the ladder. But what we are finding, of course, is that small emerging markets and developing economies are actually quite unprepared for a world with higher and higher trade walls, okay? I worry less about the large emerging market economies like India or Russia or China, Brazil, you know. But I worry a lot about things, and most emerging markets are actually small economies. So, for example, I was just tallying up the number of countries that had a GDP of more than 1 trillion, right? And you've got something like 6 or 7 in. There are 7 of them in Europe. There are 3 in North America. There are 2 in Latin America. There are 9 in Asia, and there are none in Africa. So, for example, if you look at Africa, you say it doesn't have a single big economy in a sense. So these other countries, countries in other parts of the world can actually still integrate with a larger economy in their neighborhoods, right? And Asia has many of them now. Europe always had many. North America has many. Latin America has a few, but Africa has none. And so then the question is, what should we be telling them? So I thought that if I can quickly finish my talk, then we can start to sort of get, I can start to get advice from you. Yeah? Okay. Normally, I don't ask for advice because I'm Indian. I usually know everything. In this case, even Indians don't know what to do. As I can tell from Indian foreign policy and Indian economic policy. All right. So first, the rise of populism, right? I think the big difference is that this time it's happened in the US because it's been happening everywhere else. If you look at this chart, for example, you see that here's essentially right-wing populism, this is left-wing populism. It's been going up and down, mostly up now recently. But what's happened now is, of course, that it's happened in the US, right? Now, so I actually did a bit of this thing on this thing called word hippo. I didn't know about this. But I said, okay, what's the opposite of populism? And you can't easily find anything there that's good. So populism seems to be a good thing. It's not a bad thing. So the opposites are elitism, despotism, unconcern, stuff like that, okay? And then I say, okay, what's the opposite of globalism? And then, there also you don't find anything good there. Pretty much everything is bad. Maybe one or two things are fine. And then, of course, I put the opposite of multilateralism. And I thought it would say unilateralism, but it said we don't know of any. So I thought the word hippo was started by a former World Banker. Okay. But this is the problem that actually happens when you get a populist government. You basically see tariff rates go up. You see trade to GDP go down. You see financial openness go down, right? This is from a paper in the AER from a couple of years back. Yep. So then you say, all right, how did we get here? Why did we get to this point? And I think if I had to give you a one-word answer, it would be China. That's how we got here. So I'm going to show you some charts over here. So this is, again, these are borrowed charts from somebody. And essentially what you sort of see is a deep red means, a deep red means a large current account deficit accumulated over 40 years, right, about 45 years. A deep green means huge foreign trade surpluses. Now, if you get an imbalance between Germany and UK, who cares? But if you get a big imbalance between China and US, everybody. And if you look at this chart over here, you see this. These are current account balances. The dotted line, the solid lines are advanced economies and emerging market economies. And they kind of sort of hover around zero except for this one period. But even that one period is essentially because of that deep red line and the dotted red line, the China effect, right? It's huge, huge imbalance. It goes on for a long time, right? And you should be asking yourself, all right, what was the WTO doing? What was the IMF doing? What was the World Bank doing? And you should be asking that question, because if you just think about the kind of things that actually led to that, one of them, of course, are tariffs. The other one is exchange rate manipulation. And then the third one are non-tariff measures, the kind of economic model that you take. So if you look at tariffs, for example, you would normally look to the WTO to call that out. If you look at exchange rate or currency manipulation, it should be the IMF that should be calling it out. And if it's non-tariff measures, it should be the World Bank, which should say, actually, if you go back to that period between 2000 and right around here, right around the time that China joined the WTO, to about here, when things start to become more normal, you have this problem, right? By the way, that imbalance continues today. And the best way to look at that imbalance is add up the amount of consumption spending in the world. It's about 60 trillion. Okay? Roughly speaking, a third of that is US, about 21 trillion. A third of it is Asia Pacific, 20 trillion. And a third of it is the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is basically about 10 trillion Europe and 10 trillion is the rest, okay? So the US is about a third of the world's consumption, right? And I know I've had no trouble believing it because I always joke that I look at the credit card bills that my daughter runs up. The American consumer is a formidable beast. Okay. Then if you look at China, okay, China's consumption is 7 trillion. And if you look at US GDP, it's around 30 trillion, and China's GDP is around 20 trillion. So essentially, basically, even though China's GDP is 2/3 that of the US, its consumption is 1/3, less than 1/3 that of the US. Okay, so that imbalance still continues. Yeah. Okay. So this is the populist argument, and I'm sure you've seen this. So it's not like that free trade has failed, it's just that it never existed. Or it hasn't existed in the minds of a lot of people for a long time. But that's not the way it should be. But and it has been that way because of distortionary policies. And since these policies are distortions, and since they have basically tariffs are used as a way to distort these things, the imposition of tariffs, it constitutes a suitable policy response. And if you look at this logic, it's really hard to refute it. Okay. All right. So then you say, has this caused a lot of harm? And I think trade economists would say not yet. Because if you look at the share of trade in GDP, you could say that the period of liberalization between 1980 and 2015 or so was really a great one. But it's not as if things have plummeted since, right? They've kind of steadied out. So that basically what that means is that trade, exports plus imports, are growing at roughly the same pace as GDP, right? But I think there's a general sense that things are not all good. And it's not just because people thought that this was normal, right? Even if you didn't think this was normal, you think there's something abnormal about this, right? So for example, normally speaking, I mean, every time that we have, essentially people ask me, are the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, are they useful? And the answer usually is when the world economy is doing terribly, they're very useful. When the world economy is doing well, they're useless. Okay? But this time round, the world economy seemed to be doing okay. But they were very useful meetings because everybody thought the world economy wasn't doing well, right? Okay. And this is a big part of the problem. There's a huge amount of uncertainty, unprecedented uncertainty compared with, you can go back a long way. You sort of see that this spike here was very high. And some of the sort of relief that people are feeling is this one here, that is, look, fine, tariffs are higher now, but at least some uncertainties come down. But it still remains very, very high and could spike up there again quickly. Yeah. All right. So what happens now? So basically, at least what we think is that multilateralism has to evolve. You can't have the WTO or the IMF and the World Bank work the way that they did. Okay. And so I'll show you a few slides about this. These are not very popular slides in the World Bank, and I got scolded for this. So I'm going to give you the slightly censored version. Okay. All right. So here's the thing, right? Basically, what you sort of see is that, populists actually also criticize anything that has to do with globalization, multilateralism, and so on. And all three of these organizations have been criticized, the WTO more than the IMF and the World Bank, but the IMF and the World Bank also get criticized a lot. Right? So I've been spending a lot of time in all three of those organizations. So this is a chart that we took from a paper by Corsetti, which is the twilight of Bretton Woods, because the World Bank would never write a paper that's called the twilight of Bretton Woods. But essentially what you sort of see over here is that you sort of get this evolution that looks like this, right? Trade liberalization, then capital flow liberalization, then you get this Washington consensus. This is basically unfettered trade and capital liberalization, and then sort of come over here, right? And now the question really is, if I go down a few slides, it's this, right? Actually, this arrow should be around here. Do we go that way or do we go that way? Do we go back to the pre-war period, the interwar period of retaliatory tariffs, et cetera, or do we somehow go back to something good? I like the Washington Consensus, by the way, which is why I call that very, very good. I mean, we can have debates about that too. Okay. All right. So then we sort of say, okay, let's take a look at the Bretton Woods institutions. You can loosely call the WTO also a Bretton Woods institution, because in the original discussions of the Bretton Woods, there was, I think Keynes had proposed something like, I think he or somebody else had proposed the International Trade Organization, ITO. Yeah. And that sort of over time has become the WTO. In between, it was the GATT, right? Okay. Now, if you look at the GATT, you say, and this is stuff that I've learned from people who worked at the GATT and who now work at the World Bank, right? So what they basically say is this, right? They say that, look, if you look at the general agreement on tariffs and trade, it was a consent. So it was a collection of consensus-based rules and consensus-based decisions. And when we move from the GATT to the WTO, you move from this sort of informal rules to much harder judicial law, right? And the thinking is that the US basically gave up the right to pick on countries that were adopting unfair trading practices and agreed to accept the ruling of WTO panels, right? But it was going to get something back in return. Services, not goods. Services trade and intellectual property rights would also be subject to international rules. Okay? That was the bargain. Yeah. Now, for a while, that bargain seemed to have held. Then China grew and India grew, all these economies grew. And if you sort of look at the world economy now, you sort of see what half of it is emerging markets and developing countries as a share of world GDP. The other half, are advanced economies. This was not the case. It was these other countries would all add up to 20% or so. They've gone hot, right? But the problem is that that uneven pace of growth of these countries has not been matched by equal liberalization by these countries. And some of that has to do with the way that the WTO is structured, okay? So basically what has happened now is that the US says, we don't like this, okay? Because these countries, in a sense, didn't keep part of the bargain that they were supposed to keep. And since the US can't use the carrot of further liberalization, because it's already liberalized, okay? It says, okay, what else have I got now? And if you don't have a carrot, the only thing you can use is a stick. And that's what you see, right? Now, a big part of the discussion, and actually Penny would know a lot more about this, and I'm sure some of you guys in the room, is this most favored nation clause that you have, which basically says that anybody who signs on to the WTO cannot be discriminated against by a country. So if a country extend other than, a few exceptions, in general, they have to be treated the same. So it can't be that the US says, okay, I'll be liberal with everybody, but not China. Under GATT, it could, but under the WTO, it can't. And you can sort of see that there might be a way out of the WTO in some sense to take out some of these clauses and so on and see whether or not you can still get a semblance of things which then work for the smaller, poorer countries, at least. Okay. All right. Here's the problem. I said 100 Peter Pans at the WTO. So basically, a lot of countries have a Peter Pan complex. They don't want to grow up. Okay. So countries at the WTO designate themselves as developing. Okay. Unlike at the World Bank, for example, we have a classification of measures: low income, upper middle, lower middle, high, etc. Whatever it is. You might not like it because we call a country like high income when it reaches 14,000. Okay, that's very liberal grading, right? That's like Yale grading. It's not University of Chicago. Okay, but I have to dump on you because I'm from the University of Chicago and I have an inferiority complex. So anyway, but the thing is that a lot of these countries never want to change their own designation. And everybody talks about China because China is big and China calls itself developing. But the worst offenders is not China. The worst offender, I would say, would probably be South Korea and Singapore and others. They have per capita income level that are twice, 3 times that of China, and they still call themselves developing. Why? Because it gives you a really strong initial bargaining position. You can go from there. The main difference between if you designate yourself developing, you can impose higher tariffs on advanced economy than they can on you. Okay. So India, for example, is developing. So India thinks, hey, it's not that unreasonable if I stick 64% tariffs on agricultural imports from the US, while I still get access to the US market at 4%. By the way, that's some of the negotiations that took place in the sense of saying, the US was saying to India, we are at 4, you are at 64. Okay. And basically, the crudest way to sort of summarize that negotiation was the US said, do you want us to come to 64 or are you coming down to 4? Okay, that's basically what it was. Yeah. And depending on where you're from, you think one is reasonable or not. All right. So you have quite a few of these countries that are actually quite developed. If you have 45% of the world's manufacturing output, or 30 or 33% of the world's manufacturing value added, you are developed as far as manufacturing is concerned. How much more developed are you going to get? Do you call yourself developed when you get to 100%? Okay, so clearly there is that issue. Okay, and so there's been a lot of pressure, and actually China, by the way, has actually responded very recently and said, okay, we won't assert our position. But this was just 3 weeks ago. All right, so that's the problem with that's the problem with the WTO. Let's look at the problem at the IMF. Yeah. So what you sort of see over here is this is an accounting. This is how much of that imbalance that I showed you, how much of it was because of currency manipulation? Okay. There could be other reasons, right? Greater efficiency, higher tariffs, higher non-tariff measures, etc. All of those things. But you find that actually, if at that point in 2007, if China did not keep its currency undervalued, it actually wouldn't have had much of a surplus. And since a large chunk of that surplus was with respect to the US, just that would actually cut this one from about 720 to less than 500. Okay, you could cut that by a third. You could cut that deficit by a third. So this was the problem. Now, if you go back and say, hey, what was the fund doing? Were they asleep? If you look at the fund's Article 4 agreements, you actually find that the staff of the fund was calling this out. They were saying, this is a problem. This is a problem. You can't use every opportunity to go to a much more market-determined exchange rate and so on, right? But you also found that fund management was much, much more concerned about US fiscal imbalances rather than China's monetary imbalances. Okay? So they found it much easier to scold the US on the fiscal side rather than China. That was the problem. So here, has the fund been asleep, etc. So I actually don't blame fund staff, take a look at the Article 4 agreements in 2006, for example. They call it out very, very clearly. What is the World Bank doing now? Okay, so basically what the World Bank was doing, we were doing a lot of advisory and analytical services, right? Research, diagnostics. We were also doing a lot of financial and technical support, both lending as well as aid. There was a huge emphasis on helping China prepare for accession to the WTO. This is all part of development. This is all good stuff. There was, of course, advocacy and global dialogue. You know, the World Bank was advocating a lot for China. Yeah. But then I went back and looked at World Bank reports too. I said, okay, you know, starting with this one, I think this was in 2022, there was this one, this was an earlier one, actually, China 2030. There was another one called China 2020 and so on. And then there was this thing called Healthy China, which was about the health system in China. And that was, I think that must have come out in about 2020 or so. No, it came out in 2018, just before the pandemic. So if you look at each one of these, you see the problem. You'll see the World Bank cheerleading. Okay, that's good because China's was actually doing very well. But you also want to see the other side and say, what effect is this having on, you know, where are these jobs coming from, et cetera, et cetera. Not much of that, huh? Even today, for example, if you sort of look, World Bank people don't actually talk about the global economy as a whole. They just say, okay, the developing economies are getting hammered. Okay? So all of our things would be the developing economies are important. As part of the mandate, that's fine. But you also want to sort of make sure that the long-term path is a sustainable one, because if you sort of make too much, you end up being too low. Healthy China. So I was at Duke when I looked at that, and it was just around the time of the pandemic. The pandemic started. I looked at it. There isn't any reference to SARS, to the avian flu, nothing. This report was done when Penny was chief economist. It's all her fault. I'm kidding. All right. Yeah. And I used to work in East Asia, by the way. I'm as culpable as anybody. Yeah. So we just chill it. So you say, okay, but you know what? Now things have changed. Export-led growth is not the big way out of things and so on. So for example, you look over here at China, it's domestic-led growth. This is a paper that's actually just coming out. It's been done by our trade group. Okay, so if you look at China, it's over here. It's not in the blue column like Argentina is still relying on relying on aggregate demand elsewhere. When you look at this, what you find is that there are problems. China's trade numbers don't add up. So Brad Setzer actually has been doing a lot of work on this one. And take a look at that over there. You know, basically what you sort of see is that in the first half of this year, the customs data show a big goods surplus, okay? Right? About 600, about $500 billion, yeah? But now, which means that if you sort of keep going at that pace, this is going to be like $1 trillion surplus, about 6% of GDP, something like that, right? But if you look at the current account surplus, which is reported by the central bank and so on, it's not there. So it turns out actually China's still relying a lot on the external demand somewhere else. It's not here in the US, but it's being felt a lot in Indonesia, in textiles, for example, or in many other countries like Turkey, in EVs and things like that. So there's a flood, that same flood. If I had to tell you, if I had to sum up what I learned at the annual meetings, I would say there are these three big imbalances, which imbalances means a wall is building and there's going to be a flood. Yeah. One is centered in Asia, which is the trade deficit of countries vis-a-vis China. One is centered in Africa, where there is a huge increase in the biggest increase, absolute increase and relative increase in the number of job seekers over the next 20 years coming. It's about 620 million, the biggest ever, more than what East Asia experienced or South Asia experienced, everybody, okay? And then the third one, of course, so there is that big jobs deficit, there's trade deficit, jobs deficit, and then of course there's a big fiscal deficit over here. And essentially advanced economies appear to be hooked on debt. They appear to increase debt during bad times and then increase debt again during good times. Okay. This is a terrible thing. It usually leads to fiscal dominance, where you get the government trying to pressure a central bank to keep or to lower policy rates, even though inflation is above target. Inflation here today is closer to 3 than to 2. That should be the main focus of the central bank. But there is fiscal dominance in the sense that because the public debt is getting harder and harder to finance. This is bad stuff. By the way, I don't think the American economy is going to end up paying the American economy is very resilient. But this yo-yo stuff about raising rates, lowering rates is going to create a flood. It's going to create flows that will get affected. That will affect emerging markets and developing economies. See, I'm talking like a World Banker. I just keep thinking about it. Okay. All right. So let me end with a few slides here. So what should small economies do? And so our advice so far is liberalize liberally, which means liberalize with respect to the US, but don't stop there. Extend those same terms to other countries as well. Yeah. And what's the rationale for that? It's based on work. Okay. And Mushfiq is looking at me like, you know, this is another World Bank thing saying liberalize these market types and so on. No, it's actually based on work. Okay. The first thing is you can't take access to the US market for granted. So these are numbers from 2023. And if you sort of look at this, the red means that for that particular goods category, the rate that, let's say, the typical high income economy imposes on the US is higher than what the US imposes on it. Green means that what the US imposes is higher than. Okay, so if you look at this, you find that the reds dominate, the greens. This is 2023. In 2024, same situation. Right? This was a situation that we started with. So here, US tariff 20% higher, partner tariff is much more. And if you look at that, you see, for a high income economy like Germany, it was a problem. For an upper middle income economy like China, the second largest economy, so Germany, third largest here. China, second largest here. India, fifth largest there. Okay. And then you got low income countries like Ethiopia and others. That's the same thing too. This is not something that you can take for granted for too long. Okay. And that's what you're seeing today. So these are our simulations of what each of these countries should do. And if you look at the first thing, don't respond is green. Selective liberalization means just liberalize with respect to the US. And then MFN liberalization means actually liberalize with respect to the US, but treat everybody else the same. Okay? And you see the big gains really come from liberalizing with respect to everybody. The big gains for employment and for output. So if you look what's happened now, right? So you actually have to look at this chart to see what this chart should look like. What this chart should look like is if you sort of say, okay, you know what? If the US is imposing 4% tariffs on imports from a country, and that country is imposing 64%, and that country doesn't want to come down to 4, but the US is going up to 64. That's that orange bar. That's what you sort of see for India. That orange bar is reciprocal tariff. So that's what you mostly see, other than China, where you see the green part, which has to do with the with the fentanyl. All right, so that's one. But tariffs are just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because now you also have non-tariff measures. And non-tariff measures have been rising. Here's an indicator of it. Here's a more sort of here is a bigger estimation of this in 2018. We're trying to update all of these things, but you sort of see that non-tariff measures are quite high in middle-income countries as compared to high-income countries. This is the same thing, but I'm going to stop here and I'm going to turn it back to Amit and we get some questions. Yeah.
Oh, how long?
It's in the last 25 minutes.
25 minutes? Even better. So now it's in your court. You guys have to tell me what's wrong with it.
So we, you started with populism, right?
Yeah.
And a reasonable argument could be made that from populism, if you wanted to understand it, explain it, that we should start talking about migration as opposed to trade, right? So, in the US, of course, we're seeing both ICE in the news as well as tariffs. But then if you look at populism in Germany, in Italy, France, UK, Spain, right? Then that must be a lot more to do with migration. And the issue may be even more complex in that fertility rates have been very low there. And that's true for Japan and Korea as well. So they're going to need migrants and something has to give. Right? So, but you, I don't want to hijack the conversation for migration, but you made this choice of talking more about trade. Like, yeah, where did that choice come from, or how should we?
It came from when I was looking at Brexit as well as the 2016 election. And if you look at that, you actually found that if you just looked at the geography of that, and looked at which are those were not parts of the US that were affected by migration. Right?
Yeah.
That's where they were, and those states still are the swing states. Right? I'm talking about the Great Lakes. So I'm speaking about the Great Lakes here, and I'm talking about the Midlands.
That makes sense. 2016, I agree with you completely. Do you think 2024 was different?
I think it was a continuation of that same thing, because if you look at the measures that Trump 1 actually put in, and by the way, Trump 1's policies on this thing were actually from the US Trade Representative's office. I think Bob Lighthizer was the USTR at the time. And I read through their reports very, very carefully. And they were careful reports. They were talking about, of course, they were talking about the trade deficits, but they were also talking about intellectual property, and they were talking, So I even wrote about that. But I think that at that time, and then you found that in the interim, in the next 4 years, between Trump 1 and Trump 2, a lot of those things got circumvented, either because of COVID, there was chaos, or because the Biden administration didn't actually enforce many of those things. And then the third one was the circumventing, like through third countries like Mexico. Which was actually, so I think trade still a lot, because if you sort of look at American popular opinion on migration, I suspect that normally speaking, you get this anti-migration sentiment during bad economic times, not during good economic times, and I think that'll remain. But the anti-trade sentiment, I think, will actually be pretty durable across recessions. Yes, sir.
Thanks. I just wanted to get more of your thought on the link between liberalizing for developing countries. It seems that there will be some welfare effects, but with increasing technological progress and how the general production systems are evolving, I'm just wondering whether there will be room for developing countries to to sort of bridge that employment deficit, the jobs deficit. So the link between what are the paths to creating jobs for people in these precarious, because from the policymaker side, things seem to be in a retracting kind of view. And if you consider even regionally, the African Continental Free Trade Area wants to bring trade within Africa rather than in most favored nations. So I wanted to get more your thought on linking, the message of liberalizing. How does that, continue to translate with all of these complications to jobs, bridging the jobs deficit?
Yeah, if I really had a crisp thing in that one, I would have put it in one of the slides. So the whole point of my thing was to ask you guys, like really smart people, like, from fantastic universities. So I do resent the fact that you've turned the question back on me. You're right, and I have to respond. I was gonna say, I think that in general, the sense is that, trade was very good for jobs also in these countries, especially countries that really became part of world trade, including especially the ones that inserted themselves into global value chains and so on. They did very well. They did very well in terms of employment. They did very well in terms of growth. They also did very well in terms of stability, in the sense that these global value chains actually get things stable over time. So during Penny's time at the World Bank, they wrote a very nice world development on these things. I think the sense now is that, okay, you know what? Do trade if you want to, but do trade regionally. And I think more and more what you're sort of hearing is that people say, no, we can't do trade just regionally, because say, for example, you ask Sub-Saharan Africa to do trade regionally. It's not going to be that beneficial, right? For a whole bunch of reasons. But if you think about South-South trade or trade within the global South, that these countries restrict trade with each other a lot. I think some of those liberalization benefits that I'm telling you about, they come from those problems. So they do have to liberalize a lot with respect to each other. Of course, there are other things too, like, infrastructure, trade facilitation and things like that. But those things take time. Liberalizing on at least vis-a-vis each other, right? It doesn't take that much time. I mean, it takes a few years perhaps, but not decades, That's where that comes from. Those big blue bars, they come from. Who's next? Penny? Yes, Yetman, after you.
I just wanted to express an opinion on the matter, given that you asked for our advice.
Yes, please.
So I think it's interesting that you pose this question, because anyone who has been at the World Bank ends up with the same question. So what should developing countries do? So I actually started working on that when I was there. And the result was this paper I wrote with Tristan Reed on demand-side constraints on development. And our objective was to answer exactly the question you posed. We ended up, I think, writing an ode to trade. And I don't mean free trade, but I do mean trade, because you come away with a great appreciation of what trade did for developing countries in the past, especially the smaller ones. And especially, as you said, trade with high-income markets, with the US, with Europe. So we end up with the conclusion that if these countries close their domestic markets, which is happening, these growth miracles of the past are not going to repeat themselves. At least they're not going to happen through trade. We make, the case for more, not necessarily regional, but plurilateral agreement. So, within Africa, as you said, the incomes are so low that even if you integrate regionally, you're not going to get that much out of it. But ultimately, I think, and that's not easy for a trade economist to say, but I think ultimately countries have to rely more on their domestic policies for the next few years until perhaps things change. But I don't see trade playing a major role in development, not given technology, but given the current political climate.
So, I would agree with you, but I mean, this is something that when you go to Asia, East Asia, we say very dynamic and, these guys have seized control of their own future and so on. But they're very passive, okay? They always look to the US to make changes, et cetera, still. So if there are these huge trade gains to be exploited by trading with each other, they still want to get permission from North America, for some reason, it appears. But let's say that they did do that. I think for a large part of Africa, you'd get benefits, but they'd come from static scale economies, exploiting scale economies. Not the kind of thing that you just mentioned, Penny, about the fact that you bring in new technology. Because if you look at the typical middle income economy anywhere in the world, the main thing that distinguishes it from a high income country is grossly inefficient in converting talent, capital, and energy into output. Grossly inefficient. So a big part of getting out of middle income is really becoming much, much more efficient. And the tried and proven way of that is the one that Penny just mentions. You integrate with more advanced economies like Korea did with Japan, or Japan did with the US, et cetera, whatever it is, and you bring in these technologies, and the most successful ones diffuse them. And when they diffuse them, you get this huge efficiency increase, right? We wrote a whole book on this, by the way. If you want all the numbers on this one, the last World Development Report is called it's called the Middle Income Trap. That's the story there, But then if you look at the trade, like trade is a big part of thing, because the other side of the trade coin is investment. So if you look at, for example, we just published a report on investment. Investment growth has dropped by half since the 2000s. But then you also look at trade agreements and investment agreements. They've dropped a lot for the same thing. So it all goes back to investment, but then that then goes back to trade. Yeah. Yes.
I think in the same spirit as Penny, I think my view on this is I fear that in the 80s, I think we had all this, trade is good for everybody. We'll move to the WTO, we'll move to that. And I think the fact that we see that there is closeness, we're going back to closeness, we should take that more seriously. I think we have a lot of evidence now that shows that the populism arises partially because of trade, like not just in the US, in Brazil, in Hungary, we have papers showing that at least spatially predicts voting patterns. And I think that perhaps some of the solution is not just like a blanket, we should open, because that's not really enforceable. That's like a, pooled, the coordinated national equilibrium that's very easy to deviate from. And that's what we're seeing. So perhaps the advice is to be a bit more specific to, are there ways to give advice that are, tapped to a particular country's comparative advantage and or ability to, gain from dynamics in investment. But I think that if the WTO continues with the trade is good for everybody, why isn't everybody doing it message, I think we're not gonna get out of where we are, or we're gonna continue seeing. So I think we need to take the political economy backlash more seriously, and understand, why don't people want to open up, for competition reasons.
So, I find that part of the problem now is that people don't actually write these things down. I'm talking about policymakers and so on. Everybody's so darn scared about being misinterpreted or whatever, or being taken for your words too. But so you end up having to travel and talk with them. So for example, I go to India or China or to Indonesia and so on, and you talk with the folks, right? And you say, okay, and of course there's a lot of complaint about the US. The US is doing the US. And so I ask gently, usually. So I ask more gently. So I usually ask more gently, much more gently in a place like India than China, because Indians are super sensitive. And so you ask them, and they say, it's all, it's not. You say, is there something that you did, like for example, those 6 versus 64, or keeping your financial sector shielded from US competition, that kind of thing. At least in March, there was no self-reflection. None. We are poor countries, we have to look out for our own interests. I said rich countries also want to look out for their own interest, no? I used to say, fine, they can. So, but then at the same time, you say, no, we cannot we cannot reduce our tariffs because our farmers, our poor farmers, the rice farmers, Meanwhile, India is the biggest rice exporter in the world, okay? So you can't then say, I'm going to protect my farmers, but I'm going to, so I'm going to protect my farmers at home, but I don't want you to protect your farmers. The US produces rice, at least did, okay? Read any history of South Carolina, it was rice production, it wasn't cotton, So anyway. Yes.
I wonder if one way to reconcile these two things would be to just say, like, here's a pattern or like multiple patterns of redistribution with the gains from trade that would essentially mean that we're minimizing like any kind of winners versus losers. So I guess like right now, these simulations are based on these high average returns, which the US has experienced and other countries have experienced as well. But as we know that essentially there's like, those aren't evenly distributed, leading to these populist patterns. So perhaps like thinking a bit about what types of patterns of redistribution would balance out some of these large average returns and therefore be more sustainable in the long run.
That I think, by the way, that's I don't remember all of the arguments of Bob Lighthizer, but if you read that book of his, you might end up seeing that you're uncomfortably close to his arguments. Yeah. So actually, when I presented a version of those slides, those early slides at the World Bank, some of my friends told me afterwards that they said, "Oh, World Bank MAGA." Okay. that I was actually making a case for populism. I was just reflecting on how we always sort of seen populists as bad people, And I think there is one criticism against populists that actually will probably be borne out by fact, which is that they often don't keep their word. Most politicians don't keep their word, but populists tend to do not be able to keep their word too, because they promise things that are too hard to think. And that elitists, which is the opposite of it, are, they also don't keep their word often, but the thing about it is they're more moderate. They don't make wild promises, etc. They're not extreme. But if you look at elitism over the last 10 years, it is extreme. Just take a simple thing saying, okay, you got a climate problem, right? So you have, at $50,000, you realize that you have a climate problem. So now you must stick to a country that has $3,000 a quota and say, you shouldn't be using fossil fuels, And then you say, how the hell did you go from climate problem to zero fossil fuel use? There's a huge leap of faith there. And it's an extremist argument. It's a very extreme argument. You say, no, you want to cut emissions per capita. You want to cut emissions per output, actually. Okay? And that part, by the way, is true. Middle-income countries like India, China, and others are grossly inefficient in converting energy into output. That's the big problem. Twice as inefficient, okay? Fix that. Then you can get into the other part, saying, okay, now that you fix that, 20 years hence, now you switch to cleaner fuel. But you can actually cut emissions per unit of output a lot just by switching to more efficient use. So we had lots of, and by the way, so at least in this argument, I was much more middle of the road. I got hammered at the World Bank, okay, back then. I got hammered. You have people saying you're denying climate and this, that, really, So now we are writing a report saying climate change is really coming at these countries. So they should be trying to become more resilient. But when we look at that too, you look at what happens to mortality just with simulate climate change. What happens to mortality? Then you say, what happens to mortality if you also have growth? It drops, the drop in mortality, the increase in mortality drops by 80%. Okay, and then of course you need something more than that. So you say, okay, you know what? Obviously, this means development is going to help a lot on this thing. These arguments were considered extreme not so long ago. We don't have the time. Yeah, sorry.
So I'm from Bangladesh, and we do have a large trade surplus with US. And in my estimation, that's not because of the fact that we have trade protective tariffs. It's more about the fact that US goods, say energy or cotton or wheat, is less competitive than these products from Middle Eastern countries or Russia, Ukraine, these regions. So in this situation, what the Bangladesh government is doing is they are preferentially treating US goods. Is that fair on our other trade partners like Russia or China or Middle Eastern nations? And if countries like Bangladesh start to do that, what will be the impact on these nations?
I got it. By the way, in the WTO, the big debate when I went and spoke at the WTO recently was Bangladesh's graduation from least developed status, okay, which actually got it preferential access and so on to things. Just removing that, because I mean Bangladesh had to graduate from that one. There's a handful of countries that are designated least developed, and they can't choose themselves as least developed there, right? I think that'll fix a lot of the Bangladesh issue, I think. Because it's not going to end up being able to keep tariffs so much lower and stuff like that. And by the way, I don't think one should care too much about whether or not it's with respect to the US or with respect to Russia or whatever it is, because you want it to, you're not going to run a deficit with respect to every country or a surplus with respect to every country. So you're going to run surpluses and deficits depending on your endowment and theirs, right? So I think a lot of that will actually happen along the way. Bangladesh is not the issue. The issue are the other countries that call themselves developing while capturing a big chunk of world exports in that particular category, or a big chunk of world output and so on, you know? Yeah. So, yes, ma'am.
Online question from David from Florida International University. How has the US been able to maintain a current account deficit and still maintain a very low?
Well, so, you know, a part of the issue, I think, is that the US, I mean, the opposite of a current account deficit is a capital account inflow, right? Of flow. So essentially, people are willing to hold US debt. So part of that is definitely a huge buildup of US debt. So public consumption has gone up a lot. And that's, sorry, yeah.
One person's asking you to go back to slide 33, the second last slide.
Slide which one?
33.
Second last slide.
Second last slide.
This might be your last question. Last question.
I thought we just put it on before we.
This one here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I purposely skipped it because it was going to take a long time to explain it, but that paper is coming. It's coming, okay, pretty soon, I think. Yeah. All right. Take a look at that. I mean, basically, if you look at this, you can't see it too closely. So these are tariffs on goods, and these are NTN's tariff equivalent. And you see China is over here. So the tariffs on goods is low, but the non-tariff measures are high. So I believe that's the next battle. Okay, because these are going to start to get measured, and this is going to come up. And for at least for the services trade, this is huge. They're harder to measure, and so we're trying to measure them so they'll be more controversial, but you'll be able to get it. India was somewhere. India on tariffs was very high. I'm forgetting where India is. India somewhere here, I think. Yeah. No? Great. No? Okay. We have one more question. You had a question. One last question. Yes, yes, ma'am.
I don't know that this is a short question, but I'll try it. I guess my question was sort of about our role as development technocrats and researchers in an era where kind of both the total resources in the rich world for those purposes and the political winds are kind of not behind us anymore, where we've been used to for the last 20 years really having them behind us. And so, you know, we focus on political constraints and populism and inequality in rich countries, but those are there in low-income countries as well. And I think in the past, you know, researchers and technocrats often have the ability to kind of provide some outside sweetener to support those people in liberalization policies and things that align with the Washington consensus, even if they create sort of short-term costs. And I feel like we're entering an era where that we can't really take that for granted anymore. And I don't know if there are any kind of big picture thoughts on what our strategy as people trying to push policies that we think are good in the long run, but maybe hurt in the short run, can be when we don't have those resources at our disposal anymore.
So, you know, the amount of resources needed to help countries that are still very poor, still not capable of actually looking after their poorest people because of not only because of fiscal reasons, but also administrative reasons and so on. There are about 75 of them. Okay, they don't include India, China, okay. But if you add up the population in these places, it's about a quarter of the world's population, about 2 billion. I think for them, there should be the same kind of a consensus that we had for 3/4 of the world earlier. You know, 3/4 of the world's population. So take that middle 50 out and say, you know, I think that would be success. Where you say, all right, you know, these are countries that would be considered either like everybody in them is poor, or even though the average looks okay, it's these countries have basically one natural resource or something like that, which I mean inflates its per capita income to, by the way, even when it inflates it inflates it to lower middle income levels, like 3,000 or something, right? These are not countries who, for them, they should have that same consensus. That's what.
Thank you so much.
But you guys were useless. You didn't give me an answer.
Well,
Other than Penny, who actually told me to go read the paper again. I will do that.
okay, so the next presentation, Moving to Profitability by Carolyn Conley.
Yeah, maybe something in
Yeah, this is not